Hello everyone, Nick DeCourcy with the Bright Ideas Agency here. Power Automate is an amazing tool for everything from enhancing your personal productivity to building complex solutions entire teams or companies can rely on. But in each of these scenarios, there can be a point of frustration where you hit a wall that divides a line between what data you know exists in Microsoft 365 and its tools and services, and what data the inbuilt actions in Microsoft's own Power Automate connectors gives you access to. Often, a likely solution in overcoming this barrier can be the Microsoft Graph API. So in this video, I'm going to explore the Graph API, what it is, why you might want to be using it with Power Automate, and how you go about doing so. By the end of this video, you'll know how to access graph data with the existing inbuilt HTTP actions in the Microsoft 365 connectors, and for your more complex needs, how to build a custom connector and register it in Azure to be able to leverage the full massive capabilities of Graph, all without writing a line of code. So if we jump over to my screen here, you can see this graphic from Microsoft gives a good kind of overview of the data that exists in the Microsoft 365 platform. And the Graph API is really a tool that enables you to access the vast majority of that data. And Microsoft has broken this down in this way. So if you think about it, there's lots of interconnected data within Microsoft 365. You have users have calendars, users have emails, users participate in chats, they participate in meetings. A user has a manager, a user has people who report into them, a user has co-workers. Their co-workers have documents that they are working on that a particular user might be interested in. And what the graph does is connects together all of this data, all of these different resources, in such a way that those relationships are also able to be queried and expanded upon within the requests that you make to the graph. So it's a really good way of thinking about things that traditionally may have been broken down into lots of different systems with different capabilities. That you're able to link that data together and request that data from Graph all in the same place, all using the same set of tools. Now today we're going to be looking at this from a Power Automate perspective, and accessing the Graph from Power Automate is a great way to use that no-code, low-code tool to be able to access that data. But Graph isn't simply about Power Automate. Graph is a resource that you can use across Microsoft's tools, and if you're a pro-code developer, developing any tool of your own. In fact, there's a great video that I've referenced from John Saville, which looks at the graph and accessing it within PowerShell, which I've linked to in the description of this video because it provides a really good overview. And the idea of a Graph API actually transcends Microsoft. This isn't a Microsoft-only concept. Zapier has got a good resource here on Graph APIs generally, and the first one it looks at is the Facebook Graph API. So all of your Facebook data is connected together in a similar way. So with that overview of the Graph API, let's get into some details about it, how you use it, and what you can do with it. Here I've actually brought up Microsoft's documentation on the Graph API, and you can see that calling Graph is actually very straightforward. You've got this here of this URL, graph.microsoft.com, a version of your Graph resource, and then the actual resource that you're going to use, and then whatever query parameters you use. So it's very straightforward to use it. And the best place to actually start playing around with Graph and understanding how it works is the Graph Explorer. And you can see this website from Microsoft actually lets you log in and play around with Graph API to work out what it can do. And at a very simple perspective, you can do things like all of these samples on the side. So if I want to get my profile, the URL is graph.microsoft.com/v1/me. And then if I run that, I get a response down here, which is for my particular user. But this also shows me interesting things like the permissions that we need in order to run something. So you can see that on this particular user, I've got the user.read permission consented. I've got the user.read basic.all, user.read write. So there's very granular permissions with Graph as well, which means that as we get into the later part of this video, custom connectors, you'll see how to leverage those permissions to just give your connectors access to what they need. So how does this work within the context of Power Automate? Well, let's jump over here and look at something that's simple to do in Power Automate. I've just given the example of grabbing the me object from Graph. So how would I do the same thing in Power Automate? So I have the Microsoft 365 users connector, and I can grab my profile using the get my profile action, or I could grab a user's profile using the get user profile action. And all I've done here is use the user email input from my flow trigger as the user principal name. And if we run this, you can see the data that we get out. And while it's not exactly the same, it parallels pretty well with the data that you're seeing here, that you're getting from here, or going over to get a user. You can see on Microsoft's docs on Graph, you can see that we can request me, and a parallel to that is requesting users, and then the user principal name, which is what I've done essentially over here. So I've used a user principal name, and I've got exactly the same data. So that's really straightforward, right? So how would we do that in Power Automate with Graph? So a lot of our connectors in Power Automate have an send HTTP request action. Let me just grab a parallel branch here, and let's just take a look at this just to reference this a little bit. So if I type in HTTP here, you can see that I have an HTTP request in SharePoint, in Office Outlook, in Office 365 users. There's the premium HTTP connector, the invoke an HTTP request with Azure. There's send an HTTP request in Office 365 groups. So there's a whole bunch of these. And so here I'm just sending an HTTP request using the Office 365 users connector. And my request is this graph.microsoft.com version 1, me. Let's just get rid of that because that was an example I'm going to give you in a second, but me, and then here I'm just users and user email. So we've saved that, we're going to run that and see what happens. And the flow failed to run. So why did this flow fail to run? Well, I've got an error of 400, and it's telling me that my URI is not a valid graph endpoint. And it goes on to say that the resources that I'm allowed to access are me and users. So I was looking at me, but there are particular objects that I'm allowed to reference. Messages, mail folders, events, calendar, etc., etc. And exactly the same issue here. So what's going on there, huh? Well, let's just go back to edit and just check that this is correct. So we're just going to append an events on the end of here to grab events from my calendars. We're going to save that. And when it's done saving, we're just going to test this. And you can see this is run correctly, this is not. We're still getting exactly the same error. this is run correctly, and grab the events out of my calendar. So what you'll find is that these HTTP request actions, each of them behaves a little bit differently and has certain limitations. So you're not getting access to everything in Graph API from each of these connectors. And frankly, the documentation is a little bit lacking as to what is able to connect to what. So it's a little bit kind of your mileage may vary with this depending on what you're trying to do. But what I have found, if I jump over to my next example, is, and there's a couple of other videos that reference this as well, that the groups connector seems to give you a bit more flexibility than the other connectors with HTTP actions. And obviously these get changed and updated and moved around all the time. So as I said, your mileage may vary, but if we just look here, we've got the Office 365 groups connector with their send an HTTP request action. I've got exactly the same criteria as I started off with in my first example, and I'm going to run this, and you can see this has worked perfectly well. So, as I say, I don't think there is documentation that tells you exactly what you can do in Graph with each HTTP request connector. So this can be something that you just need to play around with a little bit to fully understand. So you're probably thinking at this point, Nick, that's great that you've shown me how to do something that's a lot easier to do with the existing inbuilt connectors and actions. So why the heck would I use Graph? Well, I'm getting on to that. So let's jump on to our next example here. So here I've got two different types of actions, and I've titled this demo, How Do We Move These? So I'll explain. So I've got this action, get events, and I've selected my calendar. And I've got this action, list rows present in a table, and I've selected a file under my OneDrive with a demo table in it. And this works exactly as you would expect, and very straightforward. So I want to get items from my default calendar. I'm able to do that by selecting my calendar here in this drop down, and then I can go ahead and get all of those items. But say, for example, I want to make this dynamic. I'm in a situation where I want to be able to pick this flow up and share it with someone else, export it, bring it into a different environment, and I want this flow to do exactly the same thing as it's doing in my environment, which is grabbing my default calendar or grabbing a particular file from my, as in my user's OneDrive. Well, that's not so easy, because each of these in the background, while this looks like this is grabbing calendar, this looks like this is grabbing OneDrive for Business, let's just test this and take a look at what is actually going on in the background. So here you can see that if we look at raw inputs, actually what's going on here is that we're passing a calendar ID into this action. And that calendar ID is going to be for my particular calendar. And different people may have different default calendars. You can set a different default calendar. So the fact that this is my default calendar doesn't mean that someone else's default calendar is going to look the same or be the same. So what's going on over here? Well, this is showing the inputs OneDrive for Business. Okay, so I type OneDrive for Business and it's going to look at someone else's OneDrive for Business. Well, unfortunately, no. Like, the actual drive, there is a reference to a drive. That's your individual drive. That's not a dynamic drive. That's your individual drive and an individual file inside your individual drive and an individual table inside an individual file inside your individual drive. You pull this over to someone else's environment, it's still going to be referenced in those files. If they have access to them, then great, they can use them. If they don't have access to them, then it's going to throw up some errors, and that's not going to work. So in an example where I want to get my default calendar, how would I do that with an action in Power Automate to make this dynamic? So let's see, let's add an action down here, and I'm going to take a look at the Outlook connector and see what options I have here. So I have, let's see. So I have this one. I think the only one that's going to help me is this get calendars. So let's see what happens there. I don't have any inputs that I can put into that, so I'm just going to get all the calendars. So let's see what that does for me. Okay, so I've passed in, there's nothing I've passed in. I'm getting a list of calendars. Let's see, this user has 3 calendars, and let's see, is default calendar. I have a piece of data is default calendar, and I can see this calendar is my default calendar. So I can find the default calendar, but I'm then going to need to take the output here, and I'm going to need to do something with it in order to turn this into a default calendar, or to get the default calendar that I can pass in to get events. So, okay, that's great. Can we make that simpler with Graph? Then let's take a look. So we're going to grab our HTTP actions again, and we're going to come down to this Office 365 groups, and let's just build up a Graph request here. graph.microsoft.com/v1.0, because that's the version that we're using. So I'm going to say me, and I'm going to say calendar, and this is referencing this request here, so you can see this request gets a calendar. We get a calendar. We can get a user or group's default calendar by requesting me calendars or user/calendar or a group/calendar. So I can just directly get a default calendar. So let's come back over here. That's all we need in here. There's no extra information. Let's save this. And we're going to run it. So I just go to graph.microsoft.com/me/calendar, and then the output is just one calendar, which is my default calendar. So whereas I would have had to go through some kind of process with the data from here to find the default one, this just gives me one response. I can directly use that. So it saves me a lot of complication. So that's somewhere where using Graph has benefited me. Let's take a look at this example over here. So what am I going to need to do here? I'm going to need to get the document library ID. I'm going to need to get the file ID, the table ID. So how do I do that? How do I get these IDs out of OneDrive? Well, let's take a look at my OneDrive. And I can, let's see, what have I got here as options that I can use? So I think the one that I'm going to use here is list files in root folder. And that's just going to give me all the files that are in my root folder, and let's see what data we get about them. So that's run successfully. So let's just take a look what happened here. So I get output. I've only actually got one file in my OneDrive, so I've got this file. I get an ID for it, so that's one of the pieces of data I need. Not much else though. So what do I actually need? Let's take a look up here at these inputs. So that file ID is useful. I can use that. I don't have this drive ID down here. So where would I get that from? Well, there comes the problem. and I mean this changes all the time, so it may have changed by the time you see this video, but as it stands, I'm not aware of a way to get all of this data from this OneDrive connector. I can get some of it from SharePoint, but the SharePoint IDs don't actually work in the same way in the Excel connector as they do elsewhere in the system. So this is one area where on the left side, Graph can make my life easier. On the right side, Graph can be essential. So let's take a look at what this would look like. So I'm just going to jump over here, and you can see this is exactly the same set of criteria that I've got here. So I'm just going to take a look at this side. So I've got this request that we talked about on the last screen, and all I do is I take that request and I pass the ID of the calendar to get events, and now I could pick up these couple of actions and I could transport them to any user, and I would always get the events out of the default calendar if that's what I was looking to do. So what would I do over on the right side? So what I'm going to use is the graph search query. And so I'm going to search my drive items, and I'm going to pass a query string of the demo workbook name. And you know, I've chosen the demo workbook name here, but you could really use this in any way that you need to in order to find the right file. If you know that there's a file that you're wanting to work with, or something else that you need to work with in each user's OneDrive, then you could do that. I mean, a use case for this is that I know I've worked in some businesses where they've had quite an old-fashioned approach to maintaining vacation and work records, and that's just existed as an Excel sheet in each user's personal files. And so I could see a situation where you might want to kind of reference that information and know it exists in each user's personal files, but it's going to be an individual file for each person. So let's just run through this. So I've got this HTTP request. It's a post request to search. I say I want to search drive items, and then for the demo workbook name. I'm getting my profile from Office 365 users because I need that data later on. I'm initializing two variables, one for my drive ID and one for my file ID. And then knowing the structure of the data that comes from this request, I'm actually extracting one property of that, which is an array called hits containers, the contents of that, because that's really the data that I need to work with. Then I've got this Parse JSON, and the reason that I use this, and you don't necessarily need to use this, but I find this a useful step, because when you're constructing a flow using dynamic inputs and outputs, it can sometimes be a little bit complicated to get to the data that you want later on. You're building expressions to reference data that Flow doesn't understand that it has, because you're using a dynamic input to get that data out. And I don't come from a coding background. I like using Flow from the point of view of being able to drag things around and the kind of WYSIWYG side of things. So I always want to be able to just dynamically grab a piece of data and put it into my action. I don't like having to remember complicated expressions for every piece of data that I'm trying to pull out of an action. So I use the Parse JSON action to be able to pass whatever I've got to that action, get out a consistent set of data, and use and reference that data easily later on in my flow. So if you run into this, that with dynamic inputs, you end up with a host of complications, and you know, sometimes it kind of makes your head spin. Then this can be a quick step to making things a bit easier and making Flow work in that kind of more friendly way that it does with kind of more basics sets of actions. So all I'm doing here is taking the output of this, and I'm looking at one of the things that this gives me is the total number of hits that I get. So all I'm checking here is my total equal to 1? Well, in my situation, I know it's always going to be equal to 1, but if the answer was no, then you could either throw an error over here, or you could do something else that would be significantly more complicated to get to the right file. So I've just put that step in there for kind of what this might look like if you were going to use this. And then I've got another Parse JSON where I take simply the hit that so I only have one hit that I'm concerned about. I'm going to take that and I'm going to get the data from that. Within that hit, I have something called a parent reference, which reference where the file is located. So from that, I can set the drive ID, and from my actual hit response, I can set the file ID. And then to get my table, I can simply use the 3 pieces of data that I've got already. I've got my site, which is from my get my profile action, and that's always going to be the location of your OneDrive. I've got my document library ID, and I've got my file ID. And from that, I get my tables. So I know the structure of my file is that I only want one table there. So I check the length of the value that I get back from this action here. And so long as that length is 1, i.e. I've only found one table, I can proceed forward. And if no, again, you could add in something fairly complicated to get to the right place, or you could simply throw an error and say this isn't working, let's terminate this, either one. So here I get to what I was aiming to achieve from the start of this, which is my list rows present in a table. I've got my location dynamically, I've got my document library dynamically, I've got my file dynamically, and I've got my table dynamically. And so I could pick this up and I could pass this to any user, and so long as they had this file in their OneDrive, then this would do exactly the same as this over here as it does for me. And that, in my view, is the power of using Graph, in that you can get to some of this data that when you want to set these dynamic inputs on certain actions to make what you're doing portable and repeatable elsewhere, it gives you the ability to get to that kind of data. So now we've looked at how to connect into graph data using the connectors that you've already got access to in Power Automate. Let's move on to the second part of my examples and look at a custom connector. So to start off with, why would you want to use a custom connector? Well, we've already talked about the fact that there are some limitations with the connectors that are already existing as standard connectors within Power Automate. Now, you can use the premium HTTP connector, but from my point of view, because you need to pass the HTTP connector much of the same data, for example, authenticating with Graph, as you would to create a custom connector, the reusability of a custom connector actually has some advantages over that method. So let's think about why we might want to do this. So if I jump over to another user for an example, I'm going to go back to the last video that I made where I was talking about how to grab data from Teams webinar and get it all into one place so that we could do something with it in Power Automate and Power Apps. So I ended up with this spreadsheet that had my webinars in it, and I came to really a crashing stop because I wasn't able to access certain graph data with those standard connectors back in Power Automate that we were looking at. And what I really wanted to do was to utilize the online meetings resource that exists within Graph to get some more data out of there. And what I found was this online meetings resource you're not able to use with any of the standard connectors in Power Automate. Just to give you an example of this, I've got this, this flow here, and what I'm going to do is come back over to my webinars, and I'm going to copy a meeting join URL, which is the piece of information I need in order to filter my online meetings appropriately. And I'm going to test this. I'm going to enter my meeting join URL, run my flow, and I get an error. I can't do that. Okay, so in this example, what I've done is created a custom connector that gives me some actions to be able to get my online meeting. This is what I just tried to do from the groups connector and was unable to do that. And then a couple of other things to get some other details that I wanted to do. So let's just run this. It's going to ask me to input my join URL, so I'll just put exactly the same one in, and done, and now the flow is running. So in terms of the outputs from that, I get my online meeting, much as you can see in this here, retrieving an online meeting in the examples over at Microsoft Docs. So I won't bother going into the detail down here, but you can see that this has achieved something that we're unable to do with the default connectors, the existing connectors in Power Automate. And you can manage your custom connectors over here under Data in Power Automate. You can create and manage custom connectors. Now, the thing that you must be conscious of with using custom connectors is there is a licensing impact to using custom connectors. Connectors like Office 365 users, Office 365 groups, Outlook, OneDrive, etc. These are standard connectors. So if you have an Office 365 license that includes rights to use Power Apps and Power Automate for Office 365, then you can use those connectors. As soon as you start using the premium connectors or a custom connector, then you need a license, either a Power Automate license or some other type of license like a Power Apps license in order to use those connectors. So just be conscious of that, trying to get the most possible out of the standard connectors. Certainly if you're in an environment where your users don't already have those licenses, is very beneficial from a licensing point of view. We've jumped over here into the Azure portal. You don't need any particular Azure licensing in order to do this. I do happen to have an Azure AD license on this account, but that's unnecessary. And you're just going to jump into app registrations. You can see I already have my one here, so I'm just going to create a new one. So I can say Power Automate Graph Demo 2. And then we can just leave this as default. By default, it'll just work within your tenant, within your organizational directory. And we're just going to leave this redirect URI blank for the time being. We'll get that data from our connector later on, and then we're just going to hit register. Now, there's really three pieces of data that I need in order to make this work. And that is, I've got my application ID, I've got my tenant ID, and I need to create a secret. So let's jump over to Power Automate and see what that looks like. So I'm going to create a new custom connector from blank, and I can just call this MS Graph API Demo Connector 2. I'm going to create that. It's going to ask me if I want to start a 90-day trial. So I shall say yes for this. And then I can put a color in there if I wish to create a color. For example, I could use this one if I wanted to. I can just say this is a demo connector. I'm going to use HTTPS, and I'm going to use graph.microsoft.com. I'm going to move on to security, and I'm going to say I want OAuth 2.0 authentication, and my identity provider is going to be Azure Active Directory. And then you can see there are 3 items in here that I need to use in order to be able to use this. So the first one is my client ID. So I'm going to come back over to my app that I just created, and I'm going to copy this application client ID. I'm going to put this in here. And then I'm going to create a secret. So I come back over to here into my Azure portal. I go to certificates and secrets, new client secret, and you can set how long you want this to work for, and then you would need to come back and create a new one after that period of time. You have to give it a description, create your secret. So let's go back over here. We're going to paste our secret into here, and we're going to put our correct resource URL in here. And then we can move on to our definition. So let's say we do want to use the online meetings request here, as I just demonstrated. So I'm going to take this example, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to come back over here, I'm going to create a new action. I'm going to create a get online meeting. Okay, so I'm not going to bother giving this a description, and then the operational ID will just be get online meeting. I'm going to create a single request. My request is going to be a get, and it's going to go to https graph.microsoft.com/version 1.0, and there we go, we put that in there. And this works out on its own that we have this filter in here that we need, and goes on and creates that. Now, I can put a response in here and kind of tailor what the response is going to look like, but for the purpose of expediency, I'm not going to do that here. So I'm just going to create my connector. And there's just 2 extra things that I need to do to make this work. The first is, back on the security page, I now have a redirect URL. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to come back over to my Azure environment, and I'm going to come down here to authentication. I'm going to add a platform web, enter this URL, and click configure. And I've added that into there as the redirect URL. I'm also going to jump down here to API permissions, and you can see this currently only has the user.read permission. If I go back over to graph, you can see that the permissions I need for this particular request are online meeting artifact.read.all, online meetings.read, online meetings.read-write. So let's jump back over to here. We're going to add some graph permissions. We're going to add delegated permissions, as I will be logged in through Power Automate when running this. And we're just going to search for online meetings. And we're going to add this one, we're going to add this one, and we're going to add this one. We'll go ahead, and you can see that we now have these permissions on this particular app that we've registered. So now that we've done this, we can jump back over to Power Automate. We can go to Test. We're going to add a new connection to test this. So just select the user that you are using. Give it the permissions that you need. We now have this. So we are going to jump back over to our graph. we're going to grab the filter that we're applying in graph here. We're going to apply this here, and we're going to test the operation. And why did we get an invalid filter clause? Oh, it's because I've got the filter there actually, so I need to get rid of that. Test the operation, and that works just great. So how do we use this in Power Automate? Well, we're going to jump back over to up to this create here. Let's create an instant cloud flow, manually trigger the flow. I'm going to create that. Let me add an input, which is my URL. And we're going to access our custom connector that we just created. So let's make sure we've got the right one. Get online meeting. It wants a filter here, so we're just going to actually paste this in, and we're going to get rid of everything apart from the URL. And come down here and put in the URL dynamic content. I've actually made exactly the same error here as I made last time. I don't need that filter. Save this. And test our flow. We're just going to jump over to our webinars spreadsheet, grab this URL again, over here, put it in here, run our flow. There we go, it's worked. So I now have my meeting retrieved with my custom flow in Power Automate using the Graph API. So there we go, that's a very quick example of how to use the connectors in Power Automate to access Graph, and then how to create a custom connector in order to access Graph. And there are different ways to approach this, there are different uses for this, but hopefully this gives you the tools to be able to play around with this a little bit and start understanding how accessing the Graph API can really help you with some oddities that you find in your needs as you explore Power Automate. As always, if this has been helpful to you, please give my video a like. If you're interested in this kind of content, then please do subscribe. And if you have any questions about the content or about the topics that I've covered today, then please do reach out or drop a comment below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.